Hi friends, Mrs. Cummins here. What is this I got on? Kind of weird. Do you know anyone who wears ties? Usually people who dress formally, and usually guys, wear ties with their button-down shirt and it makes them all look all fancy and professional. This is a story about a principal who wears funny ties. And I'd like to dedicate it to Russ Mitchell, who is the principal at Lakeside Elementary. He's my boss, and he likes ties just like this principal does. So I hope you enjoy this story. Mr. Tanen's Ties by Maryann Cocca-Leffler. Mr. Tanen is the principal of the Lyndhurst Elementary School. All the children love him, and they also love his ties. Every morning the children enter the school. They check out Mr. Tanen's tie. It's a good way to start the day. Mr. Tanen has quite the tie collection. Funny ties, crazy ties, holiday ties, ties that play music, and even ties that light up. He also has a big collection of tourist ties. Anytime students go on a trip, they bring home ties for Mr. Tanen. His office closet bulges with different kinds of ties. He changes his tie several times a day depending on his mood, the weather, or what's for lunch in the cafeteria. On Frankfurter Day, he always puts on his hot dog tie. No one will know if I get mustard on it, he says. If the weather suddenly changes, so does his tie. If he is wearing his umbrella tie, you know that it's raining even before you look outside. And for official duties, he always wears his red, white, and blue tie with yellow stars. Fun patterns, huh? One day, Mr. Tanen had an important meeting with Mr. Apple at the school department. Everyone in town called Mr. Apple Mr. Crabapple because he was always grouchy and never smiled. Of course, Mr. Tanen wore the appropriate tie. It's got apples on it. Mr. Tanen, Mr. Apple began, "You are a fine principal, but there is one thing that concerns me." "What's that, Mr. Apple?" asked Mr. Tanen. "Education is serious business," said Mr. Apple. "Oh, absolutely," agreed Mr. Tanen. "You are a role model for your students." Mr. Tanen nodded. "I agree." "Therefore, you should look proper at all times." Mr. Apple pointed to Mr. Tanen's tie, "And that is not proper." He handed Mr. Tanen a plain blue tie. "This is." "From now on, Mr. Tanen, keep your silly ties in your closet. You are to wear only blue ties." Mr. Tanen was shocked. "No sports ties with soccer balls?" "No." "No tourist ties with palm trees and pink flamingos?" "No, Mr. Tanen." "No light-up tree ties at Christmas?" "No, Mr. Tanen. Blue ties, just blue, plain blue." Boring. The next day, Mr. Tanen greeted the children as usual, but something was not right. "Mr. Tanen, your tie, it's just plain blue," said Alex. Mr. Tanen felt just plain blue. He sighed. "I'm sorry, kids. It's proper blue from now on. Strict orders from Mr. Apple." "Boring," said Carlo. "How are we going to know the weather?" asked Olivia. "Or what we're having for lunch," said Kaylee. Mr. Tanen just shrugged sadly. Mr. Tanen didn't feel like talking to anyone all morning. At lunch, he wished he had on his hot dog tie. When the second grade celebrated Kristen's birthday, he couldn't wear his special tie that played "Happy Birthday to You." Alex was worried. Mr. Tanen is not the same, he thought. Early Early Monday morning, the school secretary phoned Mr. Apple. "Sir, Mr. Tanen just called in sick. He will be out all week with the blues. You will have to come to Lyndhurst School to fill in as principal." The children were surprised to see Mr. Apple greet them at the door. "I will be your principal for the week," he snapped. "Let's have straight lines, no talking, no running." "Ha, I miss Mr. Tanen already," whispered Alex. That afternoon, Mr. Apple even made recess rules. "No playing on the wet grass," he yelled. "You'll track mud into the school." Recess was no fun. The kids were happy when the bell rang. As they were filing in, they saw Mr. Apple climbing a tree. "What's he doing up there, spying on us?" Kaylee said. "I can't believe it. He's bird watching," said Olivia. See the bird that he's looking at? Do you know what kind of bird that is? "He actually looks happy," said Carlo, and that gave Alex an idea. On Tuesday, Alex gave Mr. Apple a tie with birds on it. "Thank you, Alex, but that's not quite my style." But when he was alone, Mr. Apple stared at the tie. "Cardinals are my favorite bird." That's the kind of bird it is, a cardinal, a red cardinal. He held the tie up to his plain gray suit, and he couldn't help but try it on. After school, Mr. Apple wore his new tie to the grocery store. "Hello, Mr. Apple," said the cashier, Miss Sweet. "Good day," mumbled Mr. Apple. "Lovely tie," commented Miss Sweet. "You must like birds." "I'm crazy about cats." Mr. Apple smiled a little. On Wednesday, Mr. Apple picked up his mail. Then he sat at Mr. Tanen's desk to work. But today he couldn't concentrate. He opened Mr. Tanen's closet and searched through the ties, and he found just what he was looking for. What do you see on this tie? Kitty cats? Why did he choose that? In the afternoon, he went to the grocery store again. He got in Miss Sweet's checkout line. "Mr. Apple, now that's a charming tie." Mr. Apple and Miss Sweet chatted for a long time. On Thursday after school, Mr. Apple thumbed through Mr. Tanen's ties again. This time he heard music. It was coming from a tie. Mr. Apple headed to the grocery store. When he got to the register, he pressed the tie. It played, "Let me call you sweetheart." "Mr. Apple, I never knew you could be so delightful," said Miss Sweet. Mr. Apple handed Miss Sweet a rose. "Will you have dinner with me tonight?" "I would love to, Mr. Apple." Ooh, he'd be crushing on her. On Friday morning, Mr. Apple greeted the children wearing a tie with red hearts. "Isn't that Mr. Tanen's Valentine tie?" asked Alex. Mr. Apple grinned. "Well, I don't think he'd mind if I borrowed it, do you?" "He won't mind," shouted all the kids. On Monday, Mr. Tanen came back to school. Mr. Apple was waiting at the door. "That tie, Mr. Tanen," grumbled Mr. Apple. "Sorry, sir. I got a mustard stain on my blue tie." "Well, it's a good thing, because I bought you another one," said Mr. Apple. He handed Mr. Tanen the box. Mr. Tanen sighed. He opened the lid. What kind of tie do you think is in there? Another plain blue one, you think? A big smile spread across Mr. Tanen's face. "It's just your kind of blue," said Mr. Apple. Then Mr. Apple gave him a shopping bag filled with letters. The kids have been writing me letters all week. They want their principal back, and so do I." "Thank you, Mr. Apple." "One other thing," said Mr. Apple shyly. "Would you lend me this wedding bells tie? I have an important date tonight." Dun 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 dun. The end. Isn't that a fun story? I hope you have a great weekend. Happy Friday. Wash your hands. Be good. I love you. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.